Get started. Welcome, everybody. It is so nice to see so many faces online, especially folks who we haven't seen for, like a few months or even longer. So it's great to have everybody in the house. And today we have a special webinar, first time ever, where we are doing a collaboration with the American Association for the Advancement of Science's SciLine program. And we have with us Meredith Drosbach, who is the Associate Director of Science, and Becky Hazen, who is the Associate Director for News and Operations. And this sort of came about over a few years where, some of us have been working with SciLine really, really closely. And I know Becky and Meredith are going to explain what SciLine is. It's one of the sort of really, really cutting edge linkages between science and reporting and reporters in a way that sort of elevates the science and allows reporters to have resources and contacts for stories that are either coming out, articles that have been embargoed and are just going to be released, or if there's a cutting edge piece of news or a particular topic that a lot of reporters have questions about, they've done a really, really nice proactive way of setting up these fact sheets that allow reporters to sort of hone into like sound bites and lift them out and be able to use them in their stories. And so the point of today is to start that collaboration, that official collaboration between AAAS, SciLine, and AASC, so that everybody can see what some of the resources are, and then hopefully help to join with Meredith and Becky in helping to sort of fill out a lot of the geographic gaps in markets around the US that currently exist, so that, like when a reporter in X has a question or a story, they know who to sort of tap into, because a lot of us here on the AASC are already in that database and can offer our expertise. So that's kind of like the background for why we're doing this webinar. It's not so much to sort of learn how to interact with reporters, but more sort of like how to sort of elevate a lot of the things that we're already doing. And I know a lot of you online already have like tremendous relationships with reporters in your own state and your own region, and we're just sort of like trying to leverage all of that. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Becky, who's going to get us kickstarted, and then she's going to tag team with Meredith, who's going to keep the ball rolling. And then at the very end, I know you've got some questions, looking for some feedback, so it's all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Leslie Ann and Glenn. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if you'll just bear with me for one moment. As Leslie Ann said, I'm just going to take a couple minutes to give you an overview of who we are at SciLine and the services we provide. And then Meredith is going to kick off what we hope will be a discussion with you all about your own experiences interacting with the media. So unfortunately, I'm going to start by painting a pretty dire picture of the state of journalism in the country today. This is a graph from a pretty recent Pew Research Center report. And as you can see, it shows that newsroom employment in US newspapers has declined by 47% over approximately the last decade. Newspapers have been hit especially hard, but even when you include and factor in TV stations and radio stations, which have fared just a bit better, employment in newsrooms overall has declined by about a quarter over the last 10 years. So these are trends that have been happening for a while. And here on the screen, you can see just a handful of headlines from 2018 and 2019 that show what a lot of local newspapers are struggling with day to day. The Denver Post, the Oregonian, the Omaha World Herald, Gannett, which owns a lot of local newspapers across the country. They're all really suffering and have been for some time. And one feature of these layoffs is that oftentimes specialty reporters, that is science journalists, environment and health journalists, those are often the first employees on the chopping block when it comes to layoffs. So we spent the better part of our first year of operations at SciLine traveling around the country, visiting local newsrooms. And what we found in a lot of places is that in a lot of newsrooms, the only reporters left are general assignment reporters, crime, business, and sports journalists. So there's been a real loss of scientific specialization. Now, of course, you add on top of all this, which was already happening, the pandemic, and you find that newsrooms are now getting decimated even more. So a lot of local newspapers really rely on advertising from local businesses in their community to stay afloat. So as you can imagine, as local businesses started to shut down because of COVID-19, a lot of newspapers were forced to furlough reporters, lay them off, and in some cases even reduce the frequency of how often they print and circulate their publications at all. So it's a scary world out there when it comes to just how fragile the local news ecosystem really is. It's such a core part of our democracy. It's such an important way that people get their news, especially news from their community. So it's very critical that we find ways to support and sustain it. So that's where we come in, enter Sciline. We are a small, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS. We are editorially independent, and all of our funding comes from philanthropies, so no corporate funding at all. And as you can see here, our whole mission is really to address just one slice of the pie when it comes to supporting journalism, and that is helping reporters get more and more credible science into the news cycle. So we're essentially looking to help fill that gap that's been created by all of the specialty science, health, and environment reporters getting laid off. Our team is made up of a mix of former reporters, former public affairs specialists, and several PhD scientists from across several disciplines. So we work together towards that mission of getting more science into the news. And I want to just mention here as well that because we're philanthropically funded, we're in a very lucky position to be able to do everything we do, offer all of our services for scientists and journalists completely for free. So that's something that we really enjoy. So let me just give you a quick peek at some of our services and offerings. The first one, which you can see here, is probably our most popular. We call it expert matching. It's not a dating service, although sometimes it feels like we're operating one. But this is essentially an on-demand service where reporters can get in touch with us day to day when they're working on news stories and ask us for help connecting to a scientific expert they can interview and potentially quote or use in their story or segment. We do this all day, every day, sometimes up to half a dozen or a dozen times a day. And we've spent the last few years hand building a large database of volunteer experts. And that's the database we turn to make these matches. So we collect information about scientists' areas of expertise, their research focus areas, their communications and media experience. And when a reporter comes to us seeking a source, we go to that database to find the right match. But we don't stop there. We actually personally engage on both sides of the interaction. So we work with a reporter to make sure we understand what it is they really need. And then we reach out to the scientists we think are the best match and make sure they're willing and available and able to answer those questions. So we're doing a lot of that legwork for the reporter, making their jobs a little easier and connecting them to great experts they might not otherwise have known on their own. Another service we provide, which Leslie Ann mentioned, is fact sheets. So these are very rigorously researched, concise summaries of topics in the news. I pulled out a couple examples here that I think are relevant for this group in particular. But the goal is really to distill and summarize key points about very complicated topics so that reporters who don't have a background on that topic can get quickly up to speed. We research and write those in-house, but we go through an informal peer review process for them. So we send them out usually to 3 or 4 or 5 independent scientists to make sure that every data point, every factoid is completely precise and accurate. And again, our goal is to help journalists get quickly up to speed on these issues and give them a place to pull those factoids and stats that we all know journalists love so much, and from a place they can trust. So something else that we do, which we did actually as recently as about 24 hours ago, we held a media briefing on issues related to the upcoming election. But we host online media briefings where we convene panels of scientific experts, each to present short presentations on a topic, a science topic in the news. And then we leave a lot of time for on-the-record Q&A with reporters. We do these generally about once a month, and we have pretty great turnout from reporters all over the country. So that's local journalists from some of the local newspapers I mentioned earlier, but also national reporters from places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and specialty reporters from places like National Geographic or Popular Science that specifically cover science and environment issues. So again, the idea here is to give journalists an opportunity to get the context about issues they may be assigned to cover. A lot of these reporters don't have science backgrounds, so this is a really great opportunity for them to learn and ask questions. A couple other things I just wanted to mention. We're always looking to expand our reach to more types of reporters, and that includes broadcast TV. So one of the things we learned in our first year on the road visiting newsrooms is that TV stations have a whole different set of needs than print newsrooms and even radio stations. So we really wanted to find a way to meet TV stations where they are and serve up science in formats that made sense for them. So this year we actually started facilitating what we call media tours. We bring in experts from universities across the country. We sit them in a professional studio and arrange for them to do back-to-back interviews on science topics with local TV stations across the country. We've done about half a dozen of these so far, and there have been many, many airings all across the country as a result. So we're pretty excited about this. As you can imagine, we've had to shift gears just a little bit because of the pandemic. So we're now doing all of this remotely as opposed to in a studio. Similar to media tours, we also host what we call office hours with scientists. Again, we identify excellent, articulate experts in different topics that are in the news. We invite them to give us an hour of their time, and reporters in our network can sign up for 15-minute slots to interview these experts. They can use the clips or quotes from those interviews in their news stories. And we've been really excited to see just fantastic uptake of this program since launching it just a couple months ago. And something I do want to point out about the last couple of services I mentioned, these are tactics that are often used by companies and universities when they're trying to promote a specific person or a product they're trying to sell, or maybe a research study that they want to get attention on. And I think what really sets us apart is that we have no allegiance to any particular institution or person or product. Our whole goal is really just to get good science into the news cycle. So we are always looking for excellent, diverse researchers from every corner of the country, from institutions big and small. And I think that's part of what makes journalists trust us so much, is that they know, we're really not salespeople. We're not selling anything except for good science. So I'm actually going to pause and throw it over to my colleague Meredith to round out the presentation and launch into a discussion. Meredith?
Thank you. One of our newer offerings is our tip line for scientists. And this is actually an opportunity for you to tell us about a story idea, something that you think might be of interest to reporters either in your community or potentially elsewhere in the country. we work to turn the most promising ideas that come in into pitches that we send out to reporters. We can share them with relevant reporters across our network. That might be a local TV station that we know has a particular interest in an issue, or maybe it is a national reporter that we know has been looking into particular science topics. So whether it's a hyper local story like a chemical spill or a public health concern in a local neighborhood, or something relevant to a state or even broader region, such as data about water contamination following forest fires out west. These are all ideas that you guys can send to us via our tip line, which is shown here on the screen. I'll drop in the chat as well. You can go to that URL and fill out a quick form to tell us a little bit about your idea and other things that you think we should know about it. And then we'll get back to you to talk a little bit more about the idea and think about ways that we might be able to move that ahead. So to give you a summary of everything that we have covered, as Becky told you, Sciline started 3 years ago, almost actually exactly to the day. I think it's early next week. That's our birthday. So here's a quick overview of what we've done in that time. We've worked on nearly 1,500 expert matching requests. And because we meticulously track our data, because we're scientists and science journalists, we know that we've been able to recommend a source to the reporter before their deadline 98% of the time. And we're really proud of that success rate. But a lot of that is actually also due to the roughly 1,800 experts like you who've been willing to make the time to speak with these reporters. We couldn't do what we do without scientists around the country willing to participate. And diversity is a really high priority for us in recruiting and reaching out to sources. We know here that we referred experts from all 50 states, but we're also keeping in mind diversity of gender, race and ethnicity, level of seniority, size of research institution, and other factors. Because ultimately, we want to help get more and more diverse scientific voices into the news. We found that nearly 3/4 of the stories that emerge from the expert matches we make quote at least one of those experts. And that tells us that the scientists we're referring have the right expertise and they are good communicators, which are two of our other top priorities. Finally, in the media briefings that Becky described to you earlier, we've had more than 700 reporters attend. So we're reaching a broad and diverse audience there as well. Another one of our newer activities that we've undertaken has been to create and package collections of resources on particularly timely and newsworthy issues. We began this with COVID back in the spring, pulling together media briefings and other materials that would help reporters who had suddenly been thrown into the COVID news coverage, help them with their reporting. But more recently, we've started assembling science-backed resources for reporters covering the upcoming election as well. And two that I want to highlight here are a special series of media briefings that we did on reporting on the election, both on some topical issues such as polling and surveys and voting safety and integrity. And as Becky mentioned, even just yesterday, we did a professional development type of briefing to provide reporters tips on covering election night from veteran reporters and political communicators. In addition to those briefings, our newest set of materials for reporters are what we've started calling quote sheets. Quote sheets, or for quote sheets, we solicit written quotes from a set of experts in response to commonly asked or what we anticipate to be commonly asked questions on an issue. You can see a few examples of the topics we've done recently in anticipation of science-related issues or issues for which scientific research and evidence can be informative for the election, including one on climate solutions, on police violence, and recent developments in the research and testing of COVID vaccines. These quote sheets we share widely with reporters. They're posted on our website and freely available. And since the quotes themselves are all on the record, the reporters are free to use these in their stories, so they can show up in news publications across the country. The service provides easy access for reporters to expert content and perspective, But for the scientists, it can be an opportunity also to reach a lot of reporters at once while also not having to answer the same question over and over again. So we think that it's a benefit to both sides of the house. This is a pretty new endeavor for us. We've done quote sheets on a variety of COVID topics and then some more recently on election-related topics. And we're thinking about some other topics that might be a good fit for this model in the coming months, and that includes climate. So we've told you a lot about what we do, and here are some steps that you can take if you're interested in getting involved. The easiest thing to do is to sign up for our expert database, which you can do via our website at sciline.org. This is the database to which we turn for expert matching, which Becky described to you, but we also go to that database to look for experts who might be willing to peer review our fact sheets, who we might want to invite to appear on a media briefing or in office hours. It's really our repository of scientific experts from around the country who we think would be interested in participating in some of our services. So that's the easiest thing you can do to get on our radar. I've already told you a little bit about submitting a tip to our tip line. That's an idea that we might be able to turn into a story pitch for reporters. That might be something we send to reporters in your community if it's relevant, but there might be communities elsewhere around the country that you might not know about, but we have connections into and can be able to spread that pitch a little bit more widely. And finally, you're also very welcome, and in fact, I encourage you to tell reporters that you work with regularly about Sciline. This can be, I think, particularly useful for you if reporters have contacted you about a story and maybe you can't meet their deadline, or the topic is just a little bit outside of your area of expertise. You can feel free to send those reporters our way. We'd love to be able to help and to be connected to more local reporters across the country. One of the nice things about our database and about our model is that we have reach not only to reporters around the country, but to experts around the country in universities and colleges, large and small, public and private research institutions. So we have a lot of experts at our fingertips and can send out a lot of feeder emails at once to see if we can find somebody on short notice for a reporter. Finally, we have a couple of new ideas that I'd like to share with you and have you guys think about to see if there's interest. One, we're piloting an idea right now for a small cohort of experts who've agreed to be readily available to comment on new developments in the research on COVID vaccines. These are the people who are giving us quotes to fill out those quote sheets that I mentioned, some of those quote sheets that I mentioned. And we're thinking about extending that model of a cohort to another topic, and climate is near the top of our list. The vaccine experts that we're working with have agreed that they'd be willing to give us brief written quotes, about a paragraph, maybe more if they desire, for our quote sheets on basically an ad hoc basis when news breaks. So this might be once a month, but when things get busy, maybe it's once a week. And we of course understand that things come up and prevent individuals from being able to respond promptly sometimes, which is why we put together a small group, so we can always go to a handful of people and know that we're going to get some responses. So we'd be really interested in talking about this opportunity with any of you for whom this may be of interest, and particularly sort of getting a handle and a sense of what your areas of expertise are and when we might be able to tap into that. We've had some history of in-person training for reporters in the last couple of years. We've done a series of what we call boot camps that have been 2 to 2.5 day events where we bring a whole bunch of people together in one place to do a deep dive on a particular science topic for these reporters. Obviously, that is all on hold now. But much more recently, we've developed a training program for scientists on working with media. It's so new for us that we're still actually not advertising it widely, but we're very interested in offering this opportunity to the state climatologists if there's interest. And I know that some of you probably have a lot of experience with journalists. Some might not have as much. So what we would do is really aim to provide both experienced and new communicators with information and, most importantly, opportunities to practice different elements of effective communication. And we do all of this entirely in a virtual setting. So we're going to stay in touch with Glenn and with Leslie Ann and others, and we'll continue to keep you all updated as we solidify details about these training opportunities. But we'd be very interested in working with you guys on this. So that is all of the things we wanted to present to you, but we didn't want to let the opportunity go by without hearing from you all in particular. So I've seen that there are there's at least one question in the chat that we'll address, but we'd also love to hear from you on these sort of prompt questions that I've put up, because we're particularly interested in understanding your experiences in working with the media. What's happening on the ground in your community, particularly around coverage of climate and related issues. So some of the questions we're interested in are finding out what your local outlets do really well in covering climate. What stories do you wish were being told and are not, whether that's, again, by your local reporters or maybe even at the national level. And then finally, what groups do you work closely with on climate communication issues? We have some collaborators that we've worked with on some different projects, but I'm curious who you all are working with and engaged with. So having posed those, I'm going to pause for a moment and let you guys think about that. And if you have immediate questions from the presentation as well, please feel free to drop those into the chat, and Becky and I can start answering them.
Okay, thank you so much, Meredith. That's great presentation there. I think we've got a question initially from Marjorie. Marjorie, would you like to just come online and ask it?
Sure. Hi. Thank you. That was very interesting. And I'm an associate member of AASC, not an important state climatologist like the other people, but I was sure like to sign up to be part of the expert database, because if I don't know, I'll know someone who knows, so I can help you in that line. I'm curious about the news tips. There are some sites that list the kind of webinars and seminars that are upcoming, and I've been told that some news people want to know about those, but that doesn't seem like as exciting a topic as wildfires, floods, or COVID could kill us. So could you give us any hints if that's an important news tip or a different category altogether, upcoming webinars and seminars?
Yeah, I can address that one. I'd say, I know this isn't helpful, but it depends. I think, the key is thinking through, what makes that webinar newsworthy right now? Is there something happening either in your community or in other communities across the country that make a reporter attending that seminar something they really need to be at, they really need to cover in a news story? And I think that's the key, is thinking about, will they get a story out of this? And it's not always an easy thing to think through, but I think that's really the ticket to thinking about what makes a good news tip.
So if it's a topical issue.
If it's a topical issue, and I'd say too, if you can think about, does it relate to something that's happening right now in a community? Right. And in fact, spelling that out for the reporter. Sometimes they don't make the connections themselves, and we need to do the legwork to help them, make those connections. So it's really explaining, what is it that they're going to hear or learn at that event that's relevant to something happening on the ground.
That's perfect. Thank you.
And could I just piggyback on something that Marjorie said at the beginning when she asked her question? I know that folks have already started to sign on to the database. I think Adnan has already signed on. And I would actually love to see as many members of the AASC put their expertise in there, because I know, for example, students who are working on their master's or their PhD are a little bit closer to a lot of the sort of cutting edge things than some of us who are may not have as much time to actually know a lot of that sort of stuff. So I would encourage and love to see as many of us actually sort of answer that clarion call to join the database and fill out and round out the expertise. So whether you're working nationally or internationally on agriculture or hazards or what have you, I think just broadening that range of expertise, because we're so diverse in terms of what we do really well, I think that would be sort of like one piece that I don't think any other group could actually bring to the table. So that's my push for all of us to kind of step up and say, me.
I'm signing up right now, Leslie.
Oh, go for it, Nina.
I'll just follow on to what Leslie Ann said. We get questions from reporters that span an amazing range of science related and sometimes not science related issues. And one thing that often gets overlooked is social science. And we absolutely work with social scientists. We refer social scientists to reporters. And oftentimes reporters don't even quite know what type of scientist they're looking for. They're just describing an expertise or a question they want answered. So part of our job is to parse that into how would a scientist describe their expertise in a way that would be able to answer that particular question that a reporter is posing. So we take a really wide view of the sciences and include as much as we can. The sort of flip side of that is in getting to know scientists in our database. We have been amazed over and over again to find that there is someone who studies pretty much everything you can think of. Mm-hmm. It is a marvel, the range of scientific expertise that is out there, and I just want people to know about it.
Okay, I kind of calling for questions right now. If anyone else has a question they'd specifically like to ask, and then alternatively, Meredith and Becky have kind of posed some questions for you. And I know that there are several of you folks out there that are quite active in your media, whether print or broadcast of some other nature. If you could help them out and perhaps give them some insight from your perspective on the questions that they posed, just speak now.
Well, I'll address the bottom on in climate communication. I use LinkedIn an awful lot. I use it because it's like Facebook without the cats or the emotions. And because of that link, I get contacts from different reporters. So I've got a standing list with the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post, of course, and the like. But I'm almost never quoted because I generally just divert them to one of you guys, someone who really, really knows the subject area. So I like to open up a topic of conversation, and hopefully the reporter would get to the right expert. But I'm so glad to know about you because I didn't know you existed before Glenn invited me. I noticed on the local news outlets that we noticed that the TV meteorologists are doing more on climate, and they do more when they have good graphics. So they might get graphics from NOAA to use, and that helps them, show a visual TV news. They need better visuals. They need better means to get those visuals. And one thing I've noticed is that when there is a local news story or a national news story, NOAA and other organizations are jumping on it and saying, we were able to provide this guidance for, say, the wildfires because we have this observation platform or because we have a network of surface stations. And so they use the moment to talk about the basic fundamentals that are less sexy, but that we need in order to do the jobs that we do. And how do you recommend, is that a good strategy to use the news to support your science instead of just using your science to support the news?
I can jump in and say, Absolutely. I think it should be, to the extent possible, a mutually beneficial interaction when scientists and the media are interacting. And similar to what you're describing, when we, a couple of the services that I showed you all earlier, when we're putting experts on TV, we're prepping with them. And one of the things we're helping them prepare to do is, not just answer the questions, but use the answers to their questions to talk about the value of science and the scientific process itself. So, one of our not so secret goals is to help build public trust and awareness of science. So, not just answering a question, but talking about how do I know that? What studies can I mention? What data points can I share? How can I talk about the way this was researched to help journalists and the public understand that we know this because of science? So I think it's a similar idea, and definitely a good one.
I guess I have a kind of two questions. One is, do you guys do trainings, especially for early career folks? And the second is a little more drawn out. One of the biggest challenges, and I guess it kind of relates to the second point here, what do I wish they were doing? When it comes to the media, so I'm based in California, and when it comes to the media flurries we get, it's around, some kind of extreme event like the wildfires, or if it's El Nino or La Nina or upcoming or some extreme rainfall event. And there's always a desire from the media, when I speak with them, they want to hear this is the most extreme, the most outrageous, the most something. And often it's maybe not the most, or the most extreme. And so when I've done pre-interviews with some people, I've actually been told, no, we're not going to use you. And then they defer pretty often to some people who will say this is the most extreme, and no one's checking them on that information. And so I guess I'm trying to figure out, I see this desire from the media to have these headlines, but how can we still give them useful information if it's not headline necessarily like the most extreme, the most outrageous thing ever?
I can start, and Becky, you can pick it up too. I think what you're describing is a pretty common point of contention between scientists and journalists, in that journalists are looking for typically something simple that they can share with our audience, whereas we as scientists are often wanting to make sure all of the nuance and all of the context are included, because we feel like that's important for understanding the picture completely. So it's this sort of competition between simplicity and completeness. And one of the things you can think about is how simple can you make your message and make sure that it stays accurate, right? There are lots of ways that you can explain a concept or an event that may not be as detailed and nuanced as a conversation you would have with another scientist, but it's actually not inaccurate. It's simply lacking some of that underlying detail. And the reporter can always follow up with a question and ask for more of that detail. So I think that's one aspect of what you're describing, is that slightly different needs of the two groups. I will say that reporters, there's a lot of variation in this, but a good rule of thumb to think about is that for newspapers in particular, but more broadly than that, reporters are typically writing for an 8th grade reading level. So think about how you would explain whatever the topic is you're talking about at an 8th grade level. What kind of language would you use? How much detail would you go into straight off the bat? It's a good rule of thumb.
I would just add quickly to that, in practical terms, the example that you gave, maybe it's not the most extreme event that's occurred, but maybe it's among the most extreme events that have occurred over the last decade, or maybe it is aligned with the trend of more extreme events. There are ways that you can think about phrasing it that don't go so far that you're stepping over the line, so they stay accurate, as Meredith described, but they're really distilling it down to a nugget that we know reporters are always digging for. But it's tough.
Mm-hmm.
This is Dave Robinson. I'm state climatologist in New Jersey. And first of all, I've noticed the 50% rule. I used to give 350 interviews a year. Now I give half of that. But what's disturbed me the most, and I wanted your opinions on this, is that with clickbait and whatever out there now, more often than not, the reporters are interested in the what and not the why. And sometimes I'll even have to stop them and ask them, well, don't you want to know why it was this hot, or the storm was this strong? Have you noticed that? Have you addressed that? Have you heard that from others?
I've definitely noticed it for sure. I will say, there's obviously a lot of factors that play into why that's happening. And some of it has to do with the trends I was describing at the top of the presentation, that a lot of these reporters who are covering science topics, A, don't have science backgrounds, and B, because their newsroom staffs are so cut short, they're filing sometimes 2, 3, 4 stories a day. So they're working under extremely time-stressed conditions that shouldn't mean that what they're reporting isn't complete and accurate and thoughtful. But unfortunately, I think one of the consequences of what's going on in journalism is a lot of rushed reporting. And often, the headlines are written by other people. They're not written by the reporters themselves. There's a disconnect there. But I see that as a big problem and also a big opportunity. It's why we want to get scientists more engaged with the media. We view that as a big role that people like yourselves can play in being the one to say, well, wait a second, here's why. I think it's a public service to perform.
I'll just follow that up by saying that is a piece of advice that we literally give to every expert that we refer to reporters. We send everybody a one-page tip sheet, and on that tip sheet is a bullet point about taking a step back to give some global broader context around the topic that you're talking about with the reporter, because as Becky said, they're often very time constrained and might sort of dive into the 2 questions that they need an answer to in that moment. But you have the opportunity to set the stage and make sure that you've laid that foundation for those details.
I might add that it's not always that case. I do a monthly podcast, which I think is a new avenue on weather and climate, with a reporter who has a meteorology background from Press of Atlantic City. He was one of my interns at one point. And I've also worked with Capital Weather Gang and was thrilled that they won the Pulitzer Prize last year. And one of their featured stories on climate change had to do with some situations in New Jersey. And there it's just a treat, because we worked for months on pulling data together and did a little research with them. So there still are those opportunities. And if you have the opportunity to do it, it's really very rewarding.
And I'll just a quick response to that. You're absolutely right. There are a lot of reporters out there who are really good at what they do, have a lot of great science background, and are such a pleasure to work with. I'll also add that we'll continue our plug for also taking that extra step of trying to work with reporters who might not have a science background, because they need you. I think, it may be a bit more challenging to think about how you're phrasing the answers to your questions, but these reporters need help, they want help, and they have pretty large audiences. So, people really rely on their local news outlets to consume the news. So working with journalists who may have less of a background in science is still a really important thing to do if you can.
Thank you.
I was thinking as Nina and Dave were asking their questions and framing it the way that they were, that this is where the quote service that you offer might also come in really, really handy, because if we've already thought about questions that we tend to get or ones that are coming down the pike, and have that chance to lay it out in a succinct manner that captures all the pieces that we're trying to get, that we don't get in the fly because we're trying to pack everything in. And then, the reporters can go and take that. That's one way of not getting misquoted, for example, but also a chance for us to think about what are those 3 points. They always teach you, make your 3 points, stick to your 3 points, reiterate your 3 points. And so beginning, middle, and end, you got your 3 points in a small sentence that is not going to go off the rails, right? So that quotes piece, I don't know if you have the websites that you may want to throw in there again, just so people see live what some of this looks like. Because I think it's an awesome job that you guys do with Climate Central and Susan Joy Hassel and all of the people who are working on the back end to bring this stuff to realization. What it looks like in real life, I think would be great for folks online to see.
What I've dropped in the chat is a link to our fact sheets. And as Leslie Ann referenced, we've been working with Susan Hassel on a series called Quick Facts for Any Story. And so we've been working with her organization, Climate Communication, to develop these.
Well, thank
Leslie
you.
Ann, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to pitch a question back to you, Glenn, or to Leslie Ann on, are there stories that you want to see in the news and you don't? Stories about climate or local issues that you wish were in the news and you haven't seen them.
Leslie Ann, you want to start?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, my big push is I think everybody should know when they have anything that's climate change, weather related, that there is a state climate office in their particular locale that they should feel more than willing and happy and able to reach out to and get some feedback. And I don't think that people always know that. I mean, I've been state climatologist for 24 years and I still get, I don't know, I didn't know that we had a state climatologist in our state. And I know a lot of folks, you're sitting there smiling at me or shaking your heads or running up against that too. And I think to the extent that there's this level of awareness that we've got an organization filled with people who are just eager to provide service back to the nation in terms of weather, climate change, and all these other pieces that are related or not related, I think is one of the big co-benefits that I would love to see come out of this here.
Could I follow up on Leslie Ann's statement about the quote sheets and not being misquoted? And while I fully agree with that, I assume those quotes could potentially still be taken out of context. And I say that only because I did an interview with a newspaper, and this has been a couple of years ago, about drought. And while the quotes were right, they weren't always in the proper context. And as a result of that, it went to the wire. This story got on the wire, and a couple of days later, I was getting invitations to appear on radio shows that couldn't have hardly been any further left or further right. And so it was just how the story was framed by the individual newspapers that ran it from the wire.
I'll just say that, I would like to say that's the exception rather than the rule, that it doesn't happen a lot, but of course it can. And one thing that we always recommend is that, if you do see something in a story that's not accurate or that's taken out of context or is framed in a misleading way, not to be shy about actually reaching out to the reporter to let them know. Oftentimes, most of the time, it's not intentional. It's because of a lack of background in the topic. And reporters, it's pretty devastating for them when they get something wrong. And they want to know, and they want to run a correction if they need to. So that's one thing we do always tell the experts we work with, is that if you see something that really is an error, to go ahead and reach out to the journalist and explain the situation.
Have you ever had to do that, Becky or Meredith, where there was something that was on the Sciline website that they lifted the quote, put it in, and then the context was so wrong that you had to sort of like do an intervention?
That's a good question. You know, nothing is coming to mind, and I think that's a good sign. Because we put a lot of materials out there, and we are pretty meticulous about tracking clips and stories that use the materials and resources we publish. We haven't run into issues like that. There have been one or two cases where we've facilitated a match between an expert and a journalist. They've done an interview, the story runs, and after the fact, the scientist says, hey, you know, that's not really what I meant when I said that. We gave them the same advice. We encourage them to follow up with the reporter. And oftentimes that can result in a correction if it's needed. It doesn't happen a lot though, thankfully.
So I guess my other question is, while we wait for other folks to ask theirs, for some of the smaller markets where there may be gaps, do you have any particular wish list or questions or anything that allows you to sort of broaden that reach into smaller target areas?
Well, I will say the two states at the top of my personal wish list are North Dakota and West Virginia. And that's because those are the only two states where we actually haven't been receiving requests for day-to-day support through our matching service. So that's not the only factor that is involved in answering this question, but those are two states where, yeah, any connections would be truly appreciated. Meredith, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a wish list beyond completing our map in that way. But we're very deliberate, and we work hard to make sure that we are reaching out to experts from all 50 states and in fact into Canada as well. And similarly that, for example, when we are advertising our media briefings or office hours or other opportunities for journalists, that we're reaching out quite widely there. It's not just the Washington Post and LA Times and Chicago Tribune. It's the Savannah Morning News and the Topeka Capital Journal and little radio stations all over the place. So it's something we pay a lot of very deliberate attention to.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more point to that, which is, we do our best when a reporter asks to get connected to an expert in their community to honor that request. But we've also found that a lot of local reporters are interested in talking to national experts from other parts of the country. And so one of the things we really enjoy doing, we see as a gap that we're filling is, maybe we're connecting a scientist from California to a reporter in Florida or New Jersey. So these are experts that the reporter might not have at their fingertips in their own Rolodex. But we find that by doing that, it's not just the same usual suspects getting quoted in news stories over and over again. We can really help journalists diversify the sources that they're using and quoting.
I'm Laura. I'm the state climatologist of South Dakota. And I actually just got a media request today from a radio station in Fargo. So I kind of help, and I live in the northern part of South Dakota. So I do get a lot, especially from the agriculture media. Mm-hmm. They call me quite a bit to cover kind of both the Dakotas and eastern Dakotas, I guess. But Adnan, the state climatologist, I know is active up there at NDSU, and he's a good resource as well. And the local markets are great. I'll say, getting back to your kind of questions you had on the slide earlier, I've had really great relationships with South Dakota Public Broadcasting, both the radio and TV side. And a lot of, being small market, we have less than 1 million people in the whole state, right? So people actually still read the newspaper and listen to the radio here. So social media helps, but we found that even the traditional media really goes a long way in our state. So anyways, if you have any questions about that, I'm happy to talk more, but that's kind of the short story up here.
Thank you.
Meredith and Becky, there's another question from Marjorie talking about anticipating stories and being ready in advance, if you want to speak to that.
Meaning we're climatologists, so we kind of know what's going to happen. There's going to be the snowstorm story, dampening out the fires in Colorado. There's going to be the perennial hailstone story, the extensive floods, the destroying of observation platforms because of a derecho or that sort of thing.
I'll just say off the bat, so yes. And those are exactly the types of things we would love to learn about on our tip line that we mentioned earlier. So it's definitely a great idea if you have time and bandwidth to prepare. You know something is coming on the horizon, to start thinking about what are the core messages that the scientific community would want to get out about that event that's coming down the pike. But we'd also encourage you to tell us about it, because that's something that we can share with our network of reporters, which, we have thousands of reporters in our network, and they're always looking for what is the next story. So we can be a resource in helping spread the word about that too.
And I'll just add to that, for example, if you know of reports or big studies that are coming out, we're not due for another national climate assessment for a little while, but things of that scale, you guys probably know that this is, X is coming out in 2 months. So yes, being ready for the anticipated questions, the anticipated coverage of that, I think is a really good idea. And I mentioned, the pilot program I have right now with a standing cohort of experts on vaccine development. We're thinking about wanting to create a similar model for climate issues. And so that might be an opportunity, if there were a handful of people who were interested in that, to be able to anticipate those issues. We know hurricane season is coming. Here are the questions that they're going to ask us about that, and have a quote sheet on that ready to go. Or, know when some of those things are on their way, and we can be ready for it a little bit in advance rather than reacting after the fact.
That sounds great. Thank you guys so much. Just a couple of quick questions. Can you drop in the chat the best way that people could actually contact you for anything, whether it's a group email or if you have a common link? Also, how do you all communicate either individually or en masse with people that have gotten into your database or things of that nature?
I can answer the latter at least. We reach out on an individual basis. So there are 4 members of what we call the science team with SciLine. And when we are working on a request for a reporter, for example, I will personally email 5 or 6 experts and say, here's the opportunity. Here's, it's for this outlet, and the reporter wants to ask these questions, and the deadline is at 3 today. So you would hear from one of us on a one-on-one basis.
That sounds great. And then a follow-on question. We've talked about a number of the, and you all can see in the chat is the good email to reach out directly to them. So you're filling out the database. You also are working on some of the quote sheets and things like that. So what's the best way for people to go ahead and get involved with you and be able to participate in this?
So the most straightforward way to start is to sign up for the database. That means when I search for, pick your favorite topic in the database, your name will be one of the ones that comes up. So that's step one. my hope is that we can stay in touch potentially through you, Glenn and Leslie Ann, to iron out some more details on, for example, building a cohort that might be interested in being responsive on some of the quote sheet ideas, and potentially ironing out some details about communications training opportunities, if that's something of interest to the group as well.
Thank you both for taking time out to sort of introduce us to the Sciline family, the Sciline products, the Sciline philosophy. And I think this sort of is a perfect way of leveraging all of our strengths. And so it was a great way to kind of end off the week. So I thank you for